The humble beginning. The early morning sun had barely begun to pierce through the thick clouds when Clara's alarm clock blared, waking her from the little sleep she had managed to catch. She stretched slowly, her muscles tight from another restless night. Clara's modest apartment, a reflection of her disciplined life, was tidy but simple. There were no signs here of the wealth she had amassed over the years, no indicators that she was the owner of a multi-million-dollar corporation. Today, like the past few weeks, Clara would dress in her plain uniform, tie her hair back into a neat ponytail, and step into the role of a cleaning lady, completely unrecognized, completely underestimated. As she slipped into the blue uniform with its cheap fabric and patchy logo, Clara allowed herself a small smile. This was a far cry from the tailored suits and silk blouses she was accustomed to wearing, but the simplicity felt empowering. It was her choice to appear this way, to lower herself into the very role society often scorned and overlooked. She had not forgotten the countless times she had been underestimated in her youth, dismissed for her skin color or her gender, treated as less capable or less worthy. The irony was, today she would be treated exactly the same, but this time it was on her terms. Clara had been born into a family that struggled to make ends meet. Her mother worked long hours cleaning houses, and her father, when he wasn't fighting to keep a job, was a laborer in construction. From a young age, Clara understood the grind of life and the dignity of hard work, but she also saw the cracks in society, how those who did the most menial jobs were treated as though they contributed the least. She had always believed that this was a lie, a myth perpetuated by those who stood at the top of the food chain, insulated from the realities of everyday struggles. It was this belief that had driven Clara to create her empire from scratch. She started her first tech business with nothing more than a second-hand laptop and a corner in her apartment, working late into the night after juggling low-paying jobs during the day. She poured every ounce of her intelligence, creativity, and resilience into building a business that would grow beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Over the years, she had built not just one, but several companies, each one carefully designed to disrupt industries and lift up those who were too often left behind. Yet as Clara had risen, she never lost touch with her roots. She remembered her mother's tired hands scrubbing floors, her father's exhausted face after a day in the scorching sun. Success hadn't erased these memories. It had sharpened them, reminding her of the injustices that still plagued the world of business, especially in companies like the one she now owned. This corporation had been a behemoth in the tech world, but under the surface, it was rotting from within. The previous owner, a man named Gregory Vaughn, had led the company into near ruin, treating his employees like disposable assets rather than the beating heart of the organization. His arrogant leadership had driven away innovation, demoralized staff, and poisoned the workplace culture with elitism and neglect. Clara had purchased the company in a near-collapse state, knowing that she could turn it around. But she also knew she had to understand the real problems first, problems that reports and boardroom meetings would never reveal. That was why she had decided to walk in the shoes of those on the bottom rung. She had entered the company as Clara Davis, a quiet and unassuming janitor, blending into the background like so many others who were often unseen. For the past few weeks, she had been observing, listening, and learning. As she entered the sleek, glass-walled building that morning, mop and bucket in hand, Clara was greeted with the same dismissive looks and indifferent nods from the employees who streamed past her, dressed in their business casual attire. They barely glanced at her, as though her presence was as inconsequential as the furniture. She had grown accustomed to the feeling of invisibility over the past few weeks, but each day it still struck her how people could so easily dehumanize others, especially when they believed they held no real power. "Morning, Clara," a receptionist said with forced politeness, her eyes already flicking back to her phone. "Good morning," Clara replied with a smile, though the gesture wasn't returned. She continued on to the janitor's closet, where she gathered her supplies for the day. The air in the building was crisp and cold, much like the demeanor of the executives she had come to study. Today would be another day of cleaning the boardroom, the offices and the break rooms, where she would overhear conversations, feel the weight of condescending remarks, and continue to take note of the dynamics that poisoned the workplace. But today would also be different. Today, Clara was planning her next move. The idea to pose as a cleaning lady had come to her in a moment of frustration, after reviewing endless reports about the company's dysfunction. She knew that as the CEO, she would only ever be shown what the executives wanted her to see. The true rot was deeper, hidden in the everyday interactions, and the treatment of those who were not in positions of power. Clara needed to understand the culture from the inside, from the perspective of those who worked without recognition or respect. And what better way to do that than to become one of them? As she pushed her cart toward the executive boardroom, where another strategy meeting was about to take place, Clara couldn't help but think of the irony. These men, yes, they were mostly men, would be debating layoffs and cost-cutting measures, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman cleaning their floors was the one who held their fates in her hands. They would scoff at the idea of lowering themselves to perform manual labor, yet Clara had done it willingly, knowing it would give her a perspective they would never understand. As she quietly opened the door to the boardroom and began wiping down the already clean table, the executives were too engrossed in their discussions to notice her. She listened carefully as they threw around numbers, talking about efficiency ratios, revenue projections, and how to satisfy the shareholders. But what struck Clara the most was how they discussed the employees, like they were nothing more than entries in a ledger, costs to be minimized. "We need to cut more from the bottom," said one of the men, a senior executive whose name Clara hadn't bothered to learn. The janitorial staff, maintenance, maybe even some of the lower-tier workers. "We're paying too much for people who don't really contribute." Clara's hand stilled for a moment, but she quickly resumed her work, her face expressionless. The arrogance in the man's voice grated at her, but she had expected this. The real issue wasn't just about money. It was about respect, or the lack of it. As the meeting continued, Clara finished her task and quietly left the room, but not before catching a glance from one of the younger executives, Mark Hastings. He smirked as she passed by, his eyes full of disdain. He had made his feelings about the janitorial staff clear more than once, and Clara had already noted his name as one to watch. Out in the hallway, she took a deep breath. This was exactly why she had taken this path. She needed to see, firsthand, how deep the disrespect ran, not just from the leadership, but from the culture that had been allowed to fester. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Clara wasn't just the janitor. She was the one who would make the final decisions. The moment she revealed herself as the CEO would be the moment their power, their arrogance, and their ignorance would be stripped away. And when that moment came, Clara would be ready. For now, though, she had to keep playing the role. She had more to learn, more to observe, and more to plan. The reckoning would come soon enough. But today, she was just a janitor. Tomorrow, they would learn the truth. The silent observer. The morning unfolded like any other. Clara arrived early at the towering corporate building, the brisk autumn air nipping at her face as she walked from her car to the front entrance. She pulled her janitor's coat tighter around her small frame, blending into the flow of employees who passed through the large glass doors. None of them knew the woman in the worn uniform held the power to change the course of their lives. To them, she was just another cleaner, one of the many invisible workers they barely acknowledged in their daily routine. Clara's purpose had become clear after weeks of observing the company's inner workings from the lowest level. This was more than just a failing business. It was a morally bankrupt system, full of unchecked ego and an atmosphere of quiet oppression. She had learned that the company's toxicity ran much deeper than financial mismanagement. It was ingrained in how people treated one another, especially those who had no voice in the boardroom. As she began her shift, rolling her cleaning cart through the halls, she noticed subtle changes in herself. The first week had been difficult. The humiliation and casual disregard had weighed on her more heavily than she anticipated. But over time, she became more comfortable in her role as the invisible observer, the one who could move through spaces unnoticed, gathering insights that would never make it into the reports sent to the CEO. Her plan was working, but it had come with a personal cost, one that she had expected, but not at this intensity. The first few days, she had brushed off the dismissive looks and the occasional insult. She was here to learn, not to react. But the relentless undercurrent of disrespect had begun to wear on her. Even though she knew her true position in the company, it didn't erase the sting of being treated as less than human by people she would soon command. Clara had endured racism and sexism throughout her life, and she had developed a thick skin because of it. Yet, the sheer volume of microaggressions, the offhanded comments, and the way people spoke about her as though she didn't exist, it was exhausting. Today, however, was different. Clara had reached a turning point. The lessons she had absorbed from her silent role were no longer just observations. They were becoming actionable insights, and the time was nearing for her to make her move. She was sweeping the floor outside the conference room where the executives gathered, their voices buzzing through the half-open door. She could hear them discussing yet another round of layoffs. It was the same conversation, over and over. No one was talking about innovation, long-term growth, or even the well-being of their employees. It was all about quarterly profits, cutting costs, and pleasing shareholders. She had heard enough of these conversations in her time undercover to know exactly where the problems lay. The leadership was devoid of empathy and vision, operating on autopilot, driven by greed and arrogance. Through the crack in the door, Clara caught sight of Mark Hastings, the mid-level manager whose sneering comments about janitors and low-level staff had already placed him firmly on her radar. He leaned back in his chair, his arms folded, his eyes flicking toward the spreadsheets projected on the wall. "We're not going to hit our profit goals this quarter unless we trim more fat," Mark said, his voice laced with self-importance. "We've already cut 15% from the admin teams, but we can still make cuts in areas like janitorial and maintenance. I mean, let's be real. Do we really need that many cleaners? This is a tech company, not a hospital." Laughter erupted from a few others in the room, and Clara's stomach clenched. Mark's words weren't just insulting. They were dangerous. It was the kind of thinking that had led to the company's downfall in the first place. His approach wasn't about building a sustainable business. It was about maintaining power at the expense of those who made the company function. As Clara moved away from the door, she found herself in the break room, where a handful of employees sat around, chatting over coffee. The conversations were casual, but the tone was anything but friendly. It was the same every day. People gossiping about their colleagues, making veiled criticisms, or talking about who was likely to be laid off next. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia and distrust, as though everyone was waiting for the axe to fall. Jennifer, the administrative assistant who had made snide remarks about Clara on several occasions, was holding court by the coffee machine. She was speaking to a small group, her voice just loud enough to carry through the room. "I heard they're cutting more people in maintenance," Jennifer said, stirring her coffee. "Honestly, they should just outsource it. It's not like the janitors do much anyway. Half the time they're just standing around." The others laughed, some nodding in agreement, and Clara clenched her jaw. She had overheard enough of these conversations to know this wasn't just an isolated opinion. The culture here was toxic, and it extended far beyond the executive level. It had trickled down to every corner of the company, poisoning the way people treated each other, especially those they perceived as beneath them. Clara sipped from her chipped mug, listening to the familiar chorus of complaints and dismissive comments. She had spent weeks enduring this, allowing herself to blend into the background, but it was growing harder to contain her frustration. The company's problems weren't just financial. They were deeply rooted in a lack of respect and humanity. And it was time for that to change. She stood up from the table and walked back toward the janitor's closet, her mind racing with plans. As much as Clara had seen and heard, she hadn't acted yet. She was waiting for the right moment. The moment when she could reveal herself, when she could confront the people who had treated her, and others like her, with such disdain. It was coming soon. Later that evening, Clara found herself alone in the building, as she often did after her shift ended. The halls were quiet, the office floors nearly deserted. She liked the solitude. It gave her time to reflect on everything she had witnessed during the day and to prepare for what was to come. As she pushed her cleaning cart through the empty hallways, she passed by the CEO's office, the office that would soon be hers. The nameplate on the door still bore Gregory Vaughn's name, a constant reminder of the man who had driven the company into the ground. Clara had met Vaughn once before, years ago at a tech conference. He was the kind of executive who saw himself as untouchable, a self-made man who believed his wealth and position granted him the right to treat others with disregard. His downfall had been predictable, but the mess he left behind was now hers to clean up. She stood outside the office for a moment, staring at the door. Soon, her name would be on that plate. Soon, she would step out of the shadows and into the role she had earned. And when that day came, she would do more than just leave the company out of financial ruin. She would rebuild it from the ground up, creating a place where every employee, from the janitors to the executives, would be treated with respect. But for now, she had to remain patient. The facade had to stay intact for just a little while longer. As Clara turned to leave, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. It was Mark Hastings, looking surprised to see her lingering in the executive wing so late. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice thick with condescension. "Shouldn't you be, done with your shift by now?" Clara smiled faintly, keeping her tone neutral. "Just finishing up." Mark glanced at her mop and bucket with barely concealed disdain. "Well, make sure you don't miss anything. The boardroom is a mess after today's meeting." He walked away without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Clara watched him go, her mind churning with thoughts of the future. Mark was just one of many who would soon be in for a rude awakening. He, like so many others, believed he was untouchable, that his position gave him power over others, that people like Clara were beneath him. But soon, very soon, the tables would turn. Clara took a deep breath and continued down the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate. The night air outside beckoned her, cool and crisp as she stepped through the exit doors into the quiet street. The balance of power was about to shift. Beneath the surface, the soft chime of the elevator doors echoed through the quiet hallway as Clara stepped onto the corporate floor, her worn-out shoes brushing against the polished marble tiles. The building was waking up, its employees trickling in, coffee cups in hand, their eyes still clouded with sleep. The office hummed with the sounds of machines warming up, quiet chatter from early morning meetings, and the occasional ring of a phone. But for Clara, this morning was different. As she pushed her cleaning cart across the floor, she felt the weight of the day ahead pressing down on her. The weeks of silently observing had opened her eyes to more than she had anticipated. The casual indifference to the lower-tier employees, the unchecked arrogance of those in charge, and the subtle, unspoken rules of power dynamics in the office. It was all part of a toxic ecosystem she had once hoped was merely a result of the company's financial strain. But it was deeper, rooted in the company's very soul, and Clara had begun to realize that healing this business would require more than financial restructuring. It would require a complete overhaul of the company's culture, starting from its heart. As she moved past the rows of cubicles, her eyes drifted toward the familiar faces of the employees. Some were already hard at work, their fingers flying over keyboards, their faces bathed in the bluish glow of their computer screens. Others were more relaxed, leaning back in their chairs, scrolling through social media, or chatting with colleagues about their weekend plans. But what struck Clara most were the expressions of those who sat near the back of the office. The administrative assistants, the junior staff, and the custodians like herself. Their faces were etched with fatigue, their eyes dull with resignation. These were the people who bore the brunt of the company's decline, those whose jobs were always in jeopardy when the next round of layoffs came. Clara knew their struggle all too well, and her heart ached for them. Clara had started her day earlier than usual, intending to finish her rounds before the big meeting in the boardroom. The executive team was scheduled to meet to discuss the upcoming quarter's projections, a conversation that would inevitably lead to more talk of layoffs, more strategies to cut costs by trimming the workforce. She had listened in on these meetings before, quietly cleaning the room while the men in suits argued over numbers, debating which departments to downsize. They never considered the human cost, the livelihoods that would be destroyed, the families who would be left struggling. To them, it was all a matter of margins and bottom lines. Today, however, Clara had a plan. She had spent weeks gathering information, listening to the conversations around her, and making mental notes of the key players in the company's downfall. Mark Hastings, the mid-level manager who had repeatedly shown his disdain for the low-level employees, was at the top of her list. His arrogance, his dismissal of the janitorial staff, and his constant self-promotion had made him a symbol of everything wrong with the company. Clara had observed him closely, noting how he manipulated others, deflected blame, and took credit for work he hadn't done. He was the kind of man who thrived in environments like this, where power was hoarded and responsibility was passed down to those least equipped to handle it. As Clara approached the break room, she could already hear the familiar voices of Jennifer and her group of friends, laughing and gossiping as they prepared for their day. Jennifer's voice, sharp and filled with smug satisfaction, cut through the murmur of the office like a blade. "I heard Raul almost got fired yesterday," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with amusement. "Apparently, he forgot to lock one of the storage closets, and security found it wide open. Can you imagine? They should have let him go. He's been here forever, and he still can't get the basics right." Clara's grip tightened on the handle of her cart as she heard Jennifer's words. Raul, the elderly janitor who had been with the company for over 2 decades, was one of the few people in the building who had shown her kindness since she began her undercover role. He was soft-spoken and diligent, always going above and beyond to ensure the building was clean and well-maintained. But like so many others, he was invisible to the people who wielded power in the company, just another expendable worker in their eyes. Clara had seen it happen time and time again. People like Raul, who had given years of their lives to this company, were treated as though they were disposable. Their contributions were overlooked, their efforts unacknowledged. It was this disregard for human dignity that had led Clara to take on this role in the first place, to expose the rot beneath the surface and to change it from within. Clara moved past the break room, her eyes focused on the hallway ahead. Today, she had a new mission. She had spent enough time gathering information, enough time enduring the sneers and insults from those who thought they were above her. Now, it was time to start planting the seeds of change. The boardroom was empty when Clara arrived, her cleaning supplies in tow. The large, glass-walled room overlooked the city, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the sleek, modern table. Clara began her work, wiping down the table and arranging the chairs, her movements slow and deliberate. She knew the meeting would start soon, and she wanted to be in the room when it did. She had positioned herself as a silent observer for weeks, but today she would take a more active role. As she finished cleaning, the door to the boardroom opened, and Mark Hastings strode in, his eyes narrowing as he saw Clara still in the room. "Are you almost done?" he asked, his tone impatient. "We've got a meeting in a few minutes, and the last thing we need is for this place to smell like bleach." Clara kept her face neutral, nodding as she gathered her supplies. "I'll be out of your way in just a moment." Mark huffed and moved to the head of the table, laying out his papers and pulling out his laptop. He didn't bother to look at her again, already lost in his own world of numbers and projections. Clara could feel the tension in the room as other executives began to file in, their faces set in expressions of concern and frustration. The company's financial situation was dire, and they all knew it. But what they didn't know was that the woman who was quietly cleaning their room was about to change everything. Clara lingered near the door, her hand resting on the mop handle as the executives took their seats. They barely noticed her presence, too wrapped up in their own conversations about the upcoming layoffs and cost-cutting measures. But Clara listened closely, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. She knew these men, knew their weaknesses, their fears, and their ambitions, and she knew how to use that knowledge to her advantage. As the meeting began, Clara slipped out of the room, her mind racing with thoughts of the changes she would soon implement. She had spent weeks observing the company's failures, and now she was ready to act. But before she could reveal her true identity, she needed to set the stage. She needed to show the executives that their approach, cutting costs by laying off employees, devaluing the people who kept the company running, wasn't just morally wrong, but financially disastrous. The time for quiet observation was over. Clara was ready to make her move. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself in the break room, sitting across from Raul. He looked tired, his hands trembling slightly as he held his cup of coffee. Clara could see the worry etched into his face, the fear of losing his job, the fear of being discarded after years of loyal service. It was a fear she had seen in so many others over the past few weeks, and it only strengthened her resolve. "How are you holding up, Raul?" Clara asked, her voice soft. Raul sighed, shaking his head. "It's been tough. They're talking about more layoffs, and I've been here long enough to know what that means. They'll start cutting people like me first, the ones who've been here too long, who cost too much." Clara leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "You've given this company everything, Raul. They should be valuing you, not pushing you out." Raul chuckled bitterly. "That's not how it works, Clara. We're just cogs in the machine to them. As soon as we stop being useful, they replace us." Clara's jaw tightened. She had heard enough. Raul's words were a reflection of the broken system she had uncovered. A system that valued profits over people, efficiency over empathy. But Clara was determined to change that. She would make sure that people like Raul were no longer invisible, no longer treated as expendable. As she left the break room, Clara's mind was already working, formulating her next steps. The company was on the verge of collapse, and the executives were scrambling to save themselves. But Clara knew the truth. The company's salvation didn't lie in layoffs or cost-cutting measures. It lay in rebuilding trust, in valuing the people who had been ignored for too long. And she would be the one to lead that transformation. That evening, as Clara stood outside the CEO's office, staring at the brass nameplate that still bore Gregory Vaughn's name, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. The time for revelation was drawing closer. Soon, she would step out of the shadows and into the light. Soon, the people who had scorned her, who had treated her as invisible, would see her for who she truly was. Clara took a deep breath and turned away from the office, her steps confident as she walked toward the exit. The night air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the promise of change. And Clara knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was ready. The seeds of change had been planted. Now it was time for them to grow. The moment of truth. The night before had been restless for Clara. As she lay in bed, staring up at the darkened ceiling of her small, modest apartment, the weight of the coming days pressed down on her like never before. She had spent weeks undercover, observing, listening, and enduring the kind of disrespect that would break most people. But Clara wasn't most people, and as much as the journey had tested her patience and her will, she knew it had all been worth it. She was about to change the lives of everyone in the company, from the janitors to the executives, and the thought of it filled her with a quiet, steady resolve. Morning came quickly, and Clara rose before the sun, slipping into the familiar blue uniform that had become her second skin. The city was still dark as she left her apartment and made her way to the office, the chill of the early morning air biting at her cheeks. She walked with purpose, her mind focused on the day ahead. Today was the day she had been waiting for, the day when she would begin to reveal the truth. As Clara entered the building, pushing her cleaning cart through the familiar hallways, she felt a shift in the air. There was a palpable tension that hadn't been there before, a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang over the office like a storm cloud. The layoffs, long rumored and dreaded, were finally happening. Clara had heard whispers in the break room, snippets of conversations between anxious employees who feared that today might be their last day. The company was in trouble, and everyone knew it. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly guess, was that the woman pushing the mop through the halls held the power to change their fate. As she approached the executive floor, Clara saw Mark Hastings standing outside the boardroom, his phone pressed to his ear, his face twisted in frustration. He was barking orders at someone on the other end of the line, his tone sharp and impatient. Clara slowed her pace as she approached, making sure to stay unnoticed. Mark had been the most vocal advocate for the layoffs, constantly pushing to cut more staff in an effort to salvage the company's bottom line. He had never once considered the human cost of his decisions, and today, Clara intended to make sure he understood it fully. Mark glanced up as Clara passed by, barely acknowledging her presence with a dismissive wave of his hand. To him, she was just another janitor, another invisible worker whose existence barely registered in his world of spreadsheets and profit margins. But Clara knew that would change soon enough. Inside the boardroom, the tension was even thicker. The senior executives were gathered around the long, polished table, their faces drawn with anxiety. They were all well aware of the precarious position the company was in, and the conversation that morning was focused on one thing: how to keep the business afloat without sacrificing their own positions of power. Clara moved quietly around the room, wiping down the already spotless surfaces, blending into the background, as she had done so many times before. But this time, she wasn't just listening. She was preparing for her next move. "Gentlemen, we need to be realistic," Mark said, his voice carrying across the room as he stood at the head of the table, tapping a pen against a thick stack of papers. "We're not going to hit our revenue targets unless we make some serious cuts. We've already trimmed the fat in admin and IT, but it's not enough. We need to go deeper. Maintenance, janitorial staff, these are areas where we can save a lot of money." A murmur of agreement passed through the room, and Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her. They were talking about people's livelihoods as if they were nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet, completely detached from the reality of what their decisions meant. She could see the cold calculation in their eyes, the lack of empathy that had come to define the company's leadership. It was exactly what she had expected, but it still stung to hear it so plainly. Clara continued cleaning, her face calm and neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. She had gathered enough information over the past few weeks to understand exactly how the company had ended up in this position. The arrogance, the short-sightedness, the complete disregard for the employees who made the company function, it had all led to this moment. But now, it was time to act. As the meeting droned on, Clara slipped out of the room, pushing her cart down the hallway toward the CEO's office. The brass nameplate on the door still bore the name of Gregory Vaughn, the previous owner who had run the company into the ground with his reckless leadership. Soon, that nameplate would be replaced with hers, and when it did, everything would change. But before that could happen, Clara needed to confront the very people who had perpetuated the toxic culture that had brought the company to its knees. By midday, the tension in the office had reached a breaking point. The rumors of layoffs were no longer whispers. They were being discussed openly in every corner of the building. Clara had overheard conversations between employees, their voices thick with fear and uncertainty. Some were angry, blaming the leadership for their failures, while others were resigned, already preparing themselves for the worst. It was a feeling Clara knew all too well. The helplessness that came from knowing your fate was in the hands of people who didn't care about you. Clara spent the afternoon in the break room, quietly observing the staff as they tried to go about their day. Raul sat at a table near the window, staring into his coffee cup with a look of defeat on his face. He had been with the company for over 2 decades, but like so many others, he was now facing the possibility of being let go. Clara had spoken to him the day before, offering words of encouragement, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to change his situation. Jennifer, the administrative assistant who had so often mocked Clara and her fellow janitors, was sitting with a group of her friends, her voice louder than usual as she complained about the company's problems. "I don't understand why they're keeping so many of the cleaning staff," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "It's not like we need that many janitors. They're all just standing around half the time anyway." The others laughed, nodding in agreement, but Clara felt a chill run through her. Jennifer's attitude was a perfect reflection of the company's larger problem: the complete lack of respect for the people who did the unglamorous work that kept the business running. But soon, Jennifer and the rest of them would see just how wrong they had been. Clara stood up from the table and left the break room, her mind focused on what was about to happen. The day's events had pushed the company to the edge, and now it was time for Clara to step in and pull it back from the brink. As the afternoon wore on, the executive team gathered once again in the boardroom, their faces grim as they prepared to make the final decisions about the layoffs. Clara stood outside the door, listening as Mark Hastings led the discussion, his voice full of false confidence as he laid out his plan to cut more staff. "We can save millions if we trim another 10% from the workforce," Mark said, his tone matter-of-fact. "That's the only way we're going to keep the shareholders happy." The others nodded, their faces tight with worry. No one wanted to be the one responsible for firing hundreds of employees, but they all knew it had to be done, or at least, that's what they believed. But Clara had a different plan. Taking a deep breath, Clara pushed open the door and stepped into the room. The executives looked up, surprised to see her, but quickly dismissed her as just the cleaning lady. Mark barely glanced in her direction as he continued speaking. Clara walked to the head of the table, where Mark was standing, and quietly placed her cleaning supplies on the floor. The room fell silent as the executives watched her, confused by her presence. Clara stood tall, her eyes scanning the faces of the men who had spent weeks ignoring her, belittling her, and making decisions that would destroy the lives of their employees. "I think you've said enough," Clara said, her voice steady but firm. Mark blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me." Clara smiled faintly, the moment she had been waiting for finally upon her. "I've been listening to you talk for weeks, and I think it's time you listen to me." Mark frowned, his confusion turning to anger. "What are you talking about? You're just a janitor." Clara interrupted, her smile widening. "Is that what you were going to say?" Mark's mouth snapped shut, and the other executives exchanged nervous glances. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Mark. He stared at it for a moment before reluctantly taking it, his eyes scanning the paper inside. As he read, his face paled, the realization of what was happening dawning on him. "I'm not just a janitor," Clara said, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm the new owner of this company." The room fell into stunned silence. The executives stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Mark's face had turned ashen, his hands trembling as he held the envelope. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide with fear. You're the owner," he stammered. Clara nodded. "That's right. I've been watching, listening, and learning for weeks. And now it's time for things to change." The executives remained silent, their faces frozen in shock. Clara took a step forward, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with each of them. "For too long, this company has been run by people who care more about profits than people. That ends today," Clara said, her voice strong and resolute. "We're not going to lay off the very people who keep this company running. We're going to rebuild this business from the ground up, starting with the way we treat our employees." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Clara cut him off with a sharp glance. "This company has lost its way, and it's time for a new direction," she continued. "You've all been so focused on cutting costs that you've forgotten what really makes this business work. It's people. The janitors, the maintenance staff, the administrative assistants. They are the backbone of this company. And from now on, they will be treated as such." Clara's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The executives remained silent, their faces pale with realization. For the first time, they understood that the power they had taken for granted was no longer theirs. Clara had taken control, and there was no going back. "I expect you all to be ready for a meeting tomorrow morning," Clara said, her tone firm but fair. "We're going to discuss a new strategy for this company, one that values people over profits. And if any of you can't get on board with that, then you can start looking for new jobs." With that, Clara turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the stunned executives in her wake. The weight of the moment settled over her as she made her way down the hallway, but for the first time in weeks, she felt lighter. She had done it. She had revealed the truth. And now she would begin the hard work of rebuilding. As Clara stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling in the distance, she took a deep breath and smiled. This was just the beginning. The reckoning. The city awoke to a new day, but within the walls of the company Clara now fully controlled, the atmosphere was anything but routine. The shock of her revelation the previous day had spread like wildfire. Whispers had started in the break room, passed quickly through cubicles, and soon became the dominant topic of conversation across every department. The janitor who had silently cleaned the office floors for weeks, the woman who had endured sneers and condescending remarks, was the owner of the entire corporation. Clara had expected the fallout, and she welcomed it. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the company but also for herself. Everything she had worked for, everything she had planned, had led to this moment. Now it was time to clean house, not with a mop and bucket, but with leadership and vision. The culture of disrespect, arrogance, and short-sightedness had ruled the company for far too long, and Clara was determined to uproot it once and for all. As she entered the building that morning, dressed not in her janitor's uniform, but in a sleek, tailored suit, the shift in how people treated her was immediate. The security guard at the front desk, who had previously given her little more than a nod of acknowledgement, stood up straight, offering her a wide smile and a polite greeting. "Good morning, Ms. Davis." Clara returned the smile, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of irony. For weeks, she had been invisible, just another face in a sea of workers who kept the building running smoothly, but whom no one noticed. Now, with a change of clothes and the weight of her title revealed, people were suddenly attentive, respectful, even deferential. It was the way the world worked, Clara knew, but it still stung to realize how much weight appearances carried in shaping people's perceptions. She rode the elevator up to the executive floor in silence, her mind focused on the meeting ahead. Today, she would face the board of executives again, but this time they knew exactly who she was and what she represented. Her words would no longer be those of a lowly janitor. They would carry the full authority of the company's owner and CEO. The thought gave her a sense of satisfaction, but it also filled her with a deep sense of responsibility. She wasn't just here to prove a point. She was here to rebuild, to guide the company toward a future that valued its people as much as its profits. As the elevator doors slid open, Clara was greeted by the sight of Mark Hastings, standing nervously near the conference room. His usual smug confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The man who had once spoken so casually about cutting jobs and treating employees as expendable was now visibly anxious, his face pale, and his hands fidgeting as he straightened his tie for the third time in as many minutes. Clara walked past him without acknowledging his presence, her steps measured and deliberate. She entered the boardroom where the rest of the executives were already seated, their faces a mix of apprehension and confusion. Some of them still hadn't fully grasped what had happened, how the janitor they had ignored for weeks had suddenly become their boss. But Clara wasn't interested in their confusion. Today wasn't about explaining herself. It was about laying the groundwork for the future. The room fell silent as Clara took her place at the head of the table. She let the silence linger for a moment, allowing the weight of her presence to settle in. Then, with a calm, steady voice, she began. "Good morning," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. I know yesterday's events came as a shock to many of you, but let me be clear, everything that happened was necessary. I've spent the past few weeks observing this company from a vantage point that none of you could ever see, and what I've learned has been deeply troubling. A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. Clara's words were pointed, but they weren't meant to destroy anyone, yet. This meeting was about setting the tone for the new era she intended to usher in, one that would be rooted in accountability, respect, and a renewed focus on the company's core values. I'm not here to play games or engage in power struggles, Clara continued, her voice firm. I'm here to fix what's broken, and that begins with all of you. For too long, this company has been run by people who are more concerned with their own interests than the interests of the employees who make this place function. That ends today. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the executives truly listened. They had no choice. Clara was no longer the invisible woman they could ignore or dismiss. She was the owner of the very company they relied on for their positions of power, and she held their futures in her hands. Mark Hastings, unable to contain himself any longer, leaned forward, his face a mask of desperation. Ms. Davis, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We've been doing everything we can to save this company. The layoffs. Stop, Clara interrupted, her tone cutting through Mark's excuses like a knife. The layoffs were never about saving this company. They were about protecting yourselves and your bonuses. You've made decisions that have gutted departments, left employees without jobs, and sacrificed the long-term health of this business for short-term gains. Mark fell silent, his face reddening as Clara's words sank in. He wasn't used to being called out so directly, especially not by someone he had once seen as beneath him. But Clara wasn't interested in coddling him or anyone else in the room. This company has lost its way, Clara said, her voice softening but still carrying the weight of her authority. But we're going to change that. We're going to rebuild, and it starts today. No more layoffs. No more treating employees as numbers on a spreadsheet. From now on, we're going to focus on growth, not just financial growth, but the growth of our people. That means investing in our workforce, creating a culture of respect and collaboration, and making this a place where people want to work. The room remained silent, but Clara could see the gears turning in the minds of the executives. They were grappling with the reality of what she was saying, trying to reconcile their old way of thinking with the new direction Clara was laying out. But she wasn't done. I'm giving all of you a choice, Clara said, her gaze sweeping across the room. You can either get on board with this new vision and help me rebuild this company from the ground up, or you can leave. I won't stand in the way of anyone who wants to walk out that door, but know this, if you stay, you'll be held to a higher standard. This is no longer a company that tolerates arrogance, disrespect, or indifference to the people who work here. Clara paused, letting her words sink in. She could see the tension in the room, the way some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure of what to do next. But Clara wasn't waiting for their approval or validation. She knew what needed to be done, and she was prepared to see it through, no matter who stood in her way. I expect each of you to come to tomorrow's meeting with ideas, real, actionable ideas, on how we can start this process of rebuilding, Clara said. And I expect those ideas to be focused on people, not profits. We've seen what happens when we prioritize numbers over human beings, and it's led us to where we are now. That changes today. With that, Clara stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The executives remained seated, clearly still processing what had just happened. But Clara didn't wait for their reactions. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to them to decide whether they would rise to the occasion or be left behind. As Clara left the boardroom, her thoughts turned to the larger task ahead. She knew that rebuilding the company's culture wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But Clara had spent her entire life overcoming obstacles, defying expectations, and proving her worth in a world that had often refused to see her. She was ready for this challenge, and she knew that, in the end, it would be worth it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and emails as Clara began the process of restructuring the company's leadership. She had already identified the key players who were willing to embrace her vision and had started weeding out those who were resistant to change. It was a delicate process, one that required both firmness and tact, but Clara had no doubt that she was up to the task. In the late afternoon, Clara found herself back in the break room, this time sitting across from Raul. The elderly janitor looked exhausted, his face lined with years of hard work and worry. He had heard the rumors about the layoffs, and Clara could see the fear in his eyes as he sipped his coffee in silence. "You don't have to worry about losing your job," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've put a stop to the layoffs." Raul looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "But how?" Clara smiled softly. "I'm the owner of the company, Raul. I've been watching everything that's been happening here, and I'm not going to let people like you be treated as expendable anymore." Raul stared at her for a moment, clearly struggling to process what she had just said. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, a smile of relief, gratitude, and something else Clara hadn't seen in his eyes before. "Hope." "Thank you," Raul whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Clara replied, her smile widening. "Just know that things are going to be different from now on. This company is going to change, and people like you are going to be at the heart of that change." Raul nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Clara reached across the table and gave his hand a gentle squeeze before standing up to leave. As she walked away, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over her. This was what she had worked for, what she had fought for, giving people like Raul the dignity and respect they deserved. The sun had begun to set by the time Clara left the office, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink. The city was bustling with life as people made their way home, but Clara felt a sense of calm as she walked through the streets, her steps steady and sure. Today had been a turning point, not just for the company but for herself. She had faced the people who had once ignored her, and she had emerged stronger, more determined than ever. But this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and challenging, filled with obstacles and resistance. But Clara had never shied away from hard work, and she wasn't about to start now. As she reached her apartment and opened the door, Clara allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had come a long way from the young girl who had watched her mother clean houses and her father work long hours in construction. She had built her own empire, not through wealth or privilege, but through grit, determination, and a deep belief in her own worth. Now she was ready to take the next step, a new dawn. The next morning, the city was still waking as Clara sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The quiet hum of the early hours offered her a rare moment of reflection, a chance to fully absorb everything that had transpired over the past weeks. In just a few short months, she had gone from an invisible janitor, observing the company from the shadows, to the woman in control of its future. It had been an arduous journey, one that tested her patience, resilience, and belief in herself. But she had made it. Now, with the power in her hands, she was on the brink of transforming a broken company into something new, something that reflected her values and her vision. Clara had always been an early riser, a habit she had picked up from her mother, who would begin her cleaning shifts before the sun rose. But this morning felt different. Today, she wasn't just waking up to another day at work. Today, she was leading the first full day of her new era as the CEO of a company she had spent so much time understanding, one that she was determined to rebuild from the ground up. She took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the tea relax her nerves. She knew the day ahead would be filled with challenges. There were still many people in the company who resented her sudden rise to power, executives who were skeptical of her intentions, and employees who were unsure of what the future held. But Clara had always thrived on challenges. Her entire life had been a battle against the odds, and she had never been one to back down. After finishing her tea, Clara dressed carefully. Gone were the plain, worn uniforms that had allowed her to blend into the background. Today, she wore a sleek navy blue suit that exuded confidence and authority, but without the arrogance or flashiness that had characterized her predecessors. She wasn't interested in looking powerful for the sake of appearances. She wanted her actions to speak louder than anything she wore. By the time the workday ended, Clara was exhausted but deeply satisfied. She had set the wheels in motion for the transformation she had envisioned, and while there were still many challenges ahead, she was confident that she could see it through. As she left the office that evening, walking through the lobby that had once felt so cold and indifferent, Clara felt a sense of pride welling up inside her. She had done it. She had not only survived the trials and tribulations of the past few weeks, but she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more capable than ever before. But more than that, Clara knew that she wasn't just changing a company, she was changing lives. From the janitors to the executives, every person in the building would feel the impact of her leadership, and she was determined to make sure that impact was a positive one. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling around her, Clara smiled. This was her moment, her time to shine. And she was ready. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Clara continued before he could speak. I'm not saying it will be easy. There are going to be difficult decisions ahead, but cutting more jobs isn't the answer. We need to focus on growth, not just financial growth, but the growth of our people. We need to invest in training, in leadership development, in creating opportunities for employees at every level to contribute to the success of this company. The other executives remained silent, their eyes fixed on Clara. She could see the uncertainty in their expressions, the internal calculations as they weighed the risks of following her lead. But she could also see something else, something she hadn't expected. There was a flicker of hope, a glimmer of curiosity about whether her vision could actually work. I've already spoken with our HR department, Clara said, shifting the tone of the meeting toward action. We'll be launching a company-wide initiative to gather feedback from employees at every level: janitors, administrative assistants, engineers, salespeople. We're going to listen to what they have to say, and we're going to use that feedback to guide our decisions going forward. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. It was clear that this was a radical departure from the way things had been done before. The idea of listening to employees, especially those in lower-level positions, was practically unheard of in this company. But that was exactly the point. Clara wasn't interested in maintaining the status quo. She was here to turn everything upside down. Additionally, Clara continued, I'll be holding regular meetings with staff from all departments. These will be open forums where employees can bring their concerns, their ideas, and their suggestions directly to me. We're going to create a culture of transparency and accountability, one where everyone has a voice. The executives exchanged uncertain glances. Some of them clearly didn't know how to respond to such a bold and unconventional approach. But Clara wasn't looking for their approval. She was looking for their commitment to change. I understand that this is a big shift, Clara said, her tone softening slightly as she addressed the room. But I believe it's the only way forward. We have an incredible team of people here, and I want to make sure they know that their work matters, that they matter. If we can create a culture where people feel valued, where they feel like they have a stake in this company's success, then the financial growth will follow. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, one of the executives, a woman named Lisa who had been overseeing the marketing department, spoke up. I think this is exactly what we need, she said, her voice filled with conviction. We've been stuck in the same cycle for too long, and it's not working. If we want to survive, we have to do things differently. Clara nodded, grateful for the support. Lisa's words seemed to break the tension in the room, and one by one, the other executives began to voice their agreement. It wasn't unanimous. There were still those like Mark who remained skeptical, but Clara could feel the shift. The tide was turning, and she knew that with time, she could win them over. The meeting ended on a hopeful note, with the department heads agreeing to bring their teams on board with the new direction. As the executives filed out of the room, Clara remained seated, her thoughts racing as she considered the next steps. There was so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like the company was headed in the right direction. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of meetings and conversations as Clara began to implement the changes she had promised. She spent hours talking with employees from every department, listening to their concerns and ideas, and making it clear that they were an integral part of the company's future. Some were hesitant, still unsure of what her leadership would mean for them, but others were cautiously optimistic, hopeful that this was the change they had been waiting for. By the time the workday ended, Clara was exhausted but deeply satisfied. She had set the wheels in motion for the transformation she had envisioned, and while there were still many challenges ahead, she was confident that she could see it through. As she left the office that evening, walking through the lobby that had once felt so cold and indifferent, Clara felt a sense of pride welling up inside her. She had done it. She had not only survived the trials and tribulations of the past few weeks, but she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more capable than ever before. But more than that, Clara knew that she wasn't just changing a company, she was changing lives. From the janitors to the executives, every person in the building would feel the impact of her leadership, and she was determined to make sure that impact was a positive one. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling around her, Clara smiled. This was her moment, her time to shine, and she was ready.